and welcome. I'm Charles Little, curator of medieval art in the cloisters, and I'm thrilled to have this audience here to launch a series of programs celebrating the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. And in order to launch this program, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Roberto Varela Fariña, who is the Regional Minister of Culture and Tourism for Galicia under the Xunta of Galicia. And it's my great pleasure to have him here tonight to introduce this series of programs. I must say in the beginning, as a word of extra thanks, that it's through his generosity and his good offices that this series of programs are made possible by Xacobeo, the Management Society of the Xacobean Plan, which is working in partnership with the Xunta of Galicia to promote Santiago de Compostela and all of its wonderful cultural elements of art and the past and pilgrimage, of which we're going to be hearing a lot about in the next days. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Roberto Varela.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends. First, before my intervention, I would like to show you a very short video about our country and about St. Jacob's Way. Well, that's what it's all about, walk and getting to know oneself. First of all, I want to greet you warmly, and secondly, I would like to thank the generous welcome expressed by Metropolitan Museum of New York, a gratitude I extend to entities and distinguished personalities which also take part in the organization and development of these events of the Way of Santiago. I really know how much this forum and this museum mean, because I represent the Galician Department of Culture and I have been working in this city as a member of the Diplomatic Service of Spain. These conditions explain why I am indebted to the Metropolitan. I'm convinced that we will not disappoint you. The topics we will deal transcend, contrary to what less informed audience might think, the mere regional or national sphere. It is true that talking about the Way of Santiago, we refer to a small city of the north of Spain. But it's not only that, because by studying Santiago, we analyze the genesis of Europe, which had so much to do with the articulation of this continent where we are right now and where tens of cities display, as Santiago de Compostela, the place name of Santiago. In Santiago, over the Roman crossroads which point the location of the apostolic tomb, 3 churches were built. The first one, erected in the first third of the 9th century by Alfonso II el Casto, was designed to establish the lordship and the city of Santiago by means of a ceremonial narration which reminds of the symbolic ploughed circle with which Romans determined and consecrated an urban space called to organize a new region. The second church was raised by Alfonso II el Magno, when the fame of Santiago began to extend to all the Iberian Peninsula and to the territories of the ancient Western Roman Empire. During a century and a half, this second church of Santiago attended from the admirable beauty which all the chronicles and conjectures attributed to it, the critical point of the clash of civilizations unchained by the Reconquista. That was possibly the reason why Almanzor destroyed it throughout its last Aceifa at the primes of the second millennium. The third church, built with a vision of universality and extraordinary structure, at the right moment in which the Western culture illuminated Europe, is the impressive basilica that even today is receiving us and that at the end of 2011 will fulfill 8 centuries counted from its consecration. These 3 churches were built to sign the vortex of a religious, social, cultural and political project, which we call Occident, to which Santiago contributed in a especially intense way, generating the first ways that after the fall of Rome had the opportunity to cover step to step with big infrastructures, advanced juridical and military protection, with social and traveling assistance, and with a magnificent and admirable artistic appeal in all the territories of Europe. Europe was made, as the German poet Goethe claimed in a celebrated quote, walking to Santiago, and not only for the faith which encouraged and guided the pilgrims, and which was essential in the formation of our culture. The fact of walking or officiating the way, I may say, was decisive because it made possible that a still illiterate society, which entered in the path of the first medieval Renaissance, could learn the lesson of unity that Europe wanted to show. It also developed a juridical and political architecture and the ethical and philosophical background which cherishes in the community of nations that share a Christian vision of the Greek and Roman cultures. In this sense, it could be said that Santiago, with its cathedral and its way, constitutes, visible and feasible as it is the sacred dream of Carlomagno, and wanted to copy from the Milky Way the actual organization of its idealized empire. That is why it is still true that getting to know Santiago with all that the St. James phenomenon implicates is the most achievable and creative lesson that we could receive about the birth of the West. That is the reason why Santiago breaks the geographic boundaries of Europe in order to get back to the place where the Western culture flowered, the sacred place of the end of the world. Far from losing interest in the past of the centuries or with the distance from people, has been acquiring an appeal that moves even more singular people and beliefs year after year. These people, from the immanence of their ethical convictions, search a symbol of the social dynamics that caused the invention of the proclaimed tomb by the Bishop Teodomiro in the beginning of the 9th century, with only its determination and faith. That is, in a sense, what we want to transfer to the United States and to the whole world through this universal pulpit the Metropolitan is, whose hospitality has to avail the program we present today. A program which is formed by conferences, concerts, virtual reconstructions, and expositions that implicate a considerable introduction to show what St. James's Way means. We have the fortune to count on 2 big specialists. Elizabeth Brown, Professor Emeritus from the City University of New York, and Alison Stones from the University of Pittsburgh. Elizabeth belongs to the exclusive club of experts on the European Middle Ages, and particularly on what occurred in France during this period. Her colleagues acknowledged her merits by appointing her as president of the Medieval Academy of America. Professor Stones took part in outstanding works as the critical edition of the Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago de Compostela, and previously in the Codex Calixtinus and the Shrine of St. James. In conclusion, it is a fortune to have them here. Finally, I remind you that when the 2010 Jubilee, this year, Jubilee finishes, the third church, the Cathedral of Santiago, will celebrate 8 centuries covering the Apostles' tomb. And in the union of what our three churches represent and mind, we will see the increasing number of new walkers, officiants of the way coming from further distances. I cordially invite you to take part and to walk with us in this series of programs at the Metropolitan Museum. I want to thank Charles Little for his work and his confidence in us, and I would want to thank you, all of you, for being here today. And now I think it's time for the professors to talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Well, let's begin our walk in three parts, beginning this evening with our two speakers. And it's my pleasure to have Elizabeth Brown speak to you tonight, who has also a friend of the arts. Some of you may know her work on Capetian France and the monarchy and French ceremonial rituals, but she's also has a great fondness for the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, and she's the author of a monograph on that, and working also on the Crusader windows of Saint-Denis and other related topics in the tombs of the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. But tonight, she turns her attention, she makes a link, we hope, and we know she will, between Santiago de Compostela and the French connection. Elizabeth.
First of all, let me thank you, Roberto Varela Fariña, for your words of welcome to us this evening, and for the generosity of the Xunta de Galicia in sponsoring these talks at the Metropolitan Museum. The lectures that begin tonight will continue on the 29th of October and the 12th of November, and will give us stepping stones on the route, the Camino, that leads to the culmination of the journey on the 14th of November in the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium, a full-day conference. In the morning, a team of international experts will present the remarkable three-dimensional reconstruction of medieval Santiago, the cathedral in the town, as it was at the turn of the 13th century. I have not witnessed this as yet, although there is a wonderful website, and I'll say more about that in a moment, and you can look at it in advance. Those who have seen it say it's absolutely miraculous. The session on the reconstruction will be followed by an afternoon of music, introduced by talks by Janice Mann and Margot Fassler, and then a concert by Lionheart. Today, Alison Stones and I are launching this series, and then Paula Gerson, David Simon, and Jerry Lynn Dodds will talk on the 29th of November and the 29th of October and the 12th of November. We'll all be talking about Santiago, St. James himself, and I hope everyone goes and pays homage to our St. James in the sculpture hall, clad in as a pilgrim with his shell and his hat and his staff and his book, who's giving us his blessing for this conference. The talks will focus on the saint and the cathedral built in his honor. Today, the goal of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The talks will feature the book, the 12th century book, named in his honor, Jacobus, or the Liber Sancti Jacobi, and also known for reasons I'll talk about shortly as the Codex Calixtinus. All the talks will focus on pilgrimage, and that was a wonderful video clip you showed us at the beginning. Go on to your home computers and look up El Camino de Santiago. You will be astounded at how many sites there are and what you can see on them. The marvelous pictures that are taken by the pilgrims who go on the route, their accounts of what's happened to them, the descriptions of their reactions to the experiences they have had. It's a wonderful experience, and you can see the credenzial that they have. They get stamped every night so that at the end of their pilgrimage they can get a Compostela or a certificate that they have accomplished this mission when they reach Santiago. And you can plan your own pilgrimage with plenty of advice for those who have already been on the route. And I also hope that perhaps we'll be able to see in the not-too-distant future the wonderful film called The Way, which recently won impressive accolades at the Toronto Film Festival. It was produced by Martin Sheen and his son Emilio Estevez, the first movie makers, as I understand it, ever to be permitted to film in the cathedral itself. Now, why the Cathedral of Santiago is being celebrated here in New York City in 2010, as you know, this year is a particularly holy year, one in which the feast day of St. James, the 25th of July, falls on a Sunday. This feast day celebrates the translation of James's remains to Compostela, which I'll talk about in a minute. It will not fall on a Sunday again for 11 years, so this is one to be cherished. In holy years, pilgrimage flourishes, and this year more than 200,000 pilgrims are expected to visit Compostela. It is a remarkable figure in an age as secular as ours is, particularly in view of the fact that as recently as 1985, which was not a holy year, the number of pilgrims was no more than 700, and in the last holy year, 1993, it was just half of what it's expected to be this year. This escalation of interest in and true devotion to Santiago reflects in great part the dedication of the Junta of Galicia to its mission, one that we're profiting from tonight. I wish we could see everything that the Junta has done this year, the wonderful exhibit, Compostela and Europe, which has been shown in Paris, in the Vatican City, and then in Santiago, where it closes in just a few days, alas. It honors Diego Galmirez, the 12th century prelate who can be considered one of the true founders of Santiago's fortunes. In 1100, Galmirez, who was then about 30, became one of the first bishops of Compostela, probably the fourth. In 1120, he became the first archbishop when Pope Calixtus II, and I'll have more to say about him in a moment, raised him and the see from episcopal to archiepiscopal status. It was Galmirez who worked on the cathedral, transformed it into a pilgrimage site before his death in 1140. He managed to deal with rebellious townsmen. Even more important, he added considerably to the cathedral's stock of relics when in 1102 he and his associates stole the remains of four rather minor saints, Fructuosus, Cucuphas, Sylvester, and Susanna, that had been the glory of the See of Braga in Portugal. A holy theft, but we will see in a moment why he sought additional bones for his sees. The old adage, quod abundant non nocet, it doesn't hurt to have too much. Or stocking up for the future doesn't guarantee prosperity, but it calms one's nerves. Look for this book, which is absolutely magnificent, published by Skira in 5 languages. Chuck Little's trying. I hope we're going to have copies in the bookstore here. There will be copies. And it is a magnificent achievement. Tonight, I have the honor of launching this series of lectures about Compostela and its patron saint. I'm going to commence with James Iago himself and the development of his veneration in Compostela. I'm going then to talk about the book named after him, the Jacobus, the book that solidified his fame throughout Europe. And I'm going to focus particularly on one of my favorite sections of the book, which is the magnificent story of Charlemagne's response to Iago's summons to him to free his shrine at Compostela from the control of the Muslims. But what of the French connections? If you start at the beginning of the 12th century, it's kind of a reverse story, because Diego Galmirez, the Archbishop of Santiago, made his own pilgrimage from Compostela eastwards to Rome and Cluny in 1100 and 1105. And Cluny, as you know, the center of Reformed monastic practices in northeastern France. In Burgundy, recently celebrated its own anniversary of its founding in 910. Galmirez undertook these journeys not as a pilgrim himself, but rather as an entrepreneur and a publicist. He wanted to advance the standing of his own see and its patron, and he succeeded, particularly in France, and it was French pilgrims who predominated in the period when the fame of St. James as warrior hero began to be established and then spread in the mid-12th through the 13th century. He did more. He called attention to the plight of the Christians in Spain, surrounded and threatened by the followers of Muhammad. He called attention to the need of succor from Christians fully as great as the Holy Land, to which crusades had already been directed. He laid the foundation for crusading efforts in France that would be launched into Spain. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I cannot help but think that memories of his visit to Cluny did not play a part in inspiring Peter the Venerable, the renowned abbot of Cluny, who died in 1156, to travel to Spain in 1142, perhaps make a pilgrimage to Santiago, but while he was in Spain, to put together a team of translators who produced the first translation into Latin of the Quran. The accomplishments of Galmirez and the French connections have taken us far from Santiago, and I'd like to go back to the man, the saint, who now attracts pilgrims by the hundreds of thousands to his shrine. Now, if you go back to the Christian Bible, you'll find that he and his brother John, the sons of Zebedee, were terribly important people, but there are not too many details. After Peter, they were the leading ones. They were chosen by Christ to witness his transfiguration. They were mentioned as being present on the Mount of Olives and at Gethsemane. Jesus called him and his brother sons of thunder. They had their weaknesses, just like Peter. They were rebuked by Jesus for asking, please, could they sit on his right and left hand at the final judgment? They were rebuked again when they wanted to bring down fire and thunder like Elias on people who were not friends of Jesus. But they were wonderful people, and any land would have been happy to have them as evangelists. But the Bible doesn't say much about where they preached or what they did, and it does say that James was the first of the apostles to be killed by Herod. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword, after which, because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also, quoting from Acts of the Apostles. So James was numbered among the chief of Christ's followers, the first apostolic martyr to the faith, and later admirers duly turned those things that Christ had criticized into virtues. Their overwhelming interest in the end of time, their deep devotion to Christ. Now, you may have noticed that the Christian Bible says nothing about Galicia or Spain. So how did James, the specially favored disciple of Jesus, come to be linked with Compostela? The process took a very long time indeed, and was the work of a number of exceedingly inventive and imaginative minds who really wanted tangible and traceable links between their own churches and Christ's apostles. And it wasn't just Spain. By the end of the 8th century, James was indeed linked with Spain, but every other land had his favorite apostle. Philip was linked with Gaul or France. Now, Philip didn't take in France. He was displaced in favor of Denis, who wasn't really an apostle. He was supposed to be a convert of St. Paul's on the Areopagus. And Denis, in turn, was threatened when devotees of Saint Martial in Limoges tried to prove that he was an apostle. Denis triumphed. James was never threatened. James, even when the devotees of Saint Denis tried to prove that Eugenius was the real evangelist of Spain, the first bishop of Toledo. As you can see, jealousies, imaginations, ambitions ran high and riot in those centuries, particularly when there weren't many written sources and memories were pliable. Problems remained since flat assertions inspired by wishful thinking cry out for logical underpinnings. In James's case, the Bible provided none. Now, bones and tombs can substitute for written evidence. And as you've heard, by the 9th century, James' earthly remains had come to be linked with Compostela. Also, inconveniently, with the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem, Caesarea in Palestine, and a place called Achaia Marmarica. Toward the end of the 9th century, Usuard, a monk of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, came to Spain's assistance. Again, the French connection. In his authoritative catalogue of saints, he declared flat out that James's most holy bones were transferred from Jerusalem to Spain and buried in its outermost region, where they are venerated with exceeding reverence by the people there. Supposedly, at the beginning of the century, the actual tomb had been discovered at Compostela, and we have an expert here who assures us that that's true. A shower of stars revealed that this had happened. And Usuard didn't mention Compostela, which is very interesting. Now, I have been told, and it may be false, that the first recorded pilgrim to Compostela was not recorded until 950, which means that news traveled slowly. But in any case, pilgrims soon began to flock, and then the work of constructing the story to explain how it was that the bones were there began in earnest. And in the end, a perfectly marvelous story was pieced together. Embroidered, elaborated, it took its form in the 11th and early 12th century. At this time, James was believed to have actually preached in Spain. Now, unfortunately, he is said in one story to have had one convert. In the most he is credited with is 9, and he went back to Jerusalem. Whether sadly because he hadn't done any better, I'm not sure. But in any case, when he got back to Jerusalem, he was killed by Herod. Then his followers managed to get his body, and they found a boat. The only problem was the boat was rudderless, but never mind. They sailed off, trusting in God. Now, miraculously, the boat made its way, if you can imagine, rudderless, all the way through the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up along the coast of Spain, and there it stopped. The faithful followers took his body from the boat, put it on a rock that miraculously melted and enfolded it, making a sarcophagus. Now, I can't go into all the adventures that these people had. There was a queen named Lupa, the she-wolf, who was eventually converted to Christianity. There was another pagan ruler to whom she sent them in an unfriendly gesture, but God oversaw them and made sure that the bridge over which this other king was chasing them crumbled. Then wild bulls, who were tamed and docile as the sign of the cross was made, and all of a sudden they wanted to transport the body. A ferocious dragon barred the road. Again, the sign of the cross, and the dragon split in two. Finally, James's body was interred in a tomb guarded by his followers. The stories about James were treasured at the site that claimed to house his remains. It seems more than likely that the problems posed by the gap in time between Christ's time and the 9th century may have encouraged Diego Galmirez down the garden path of criminality and caused him and his companions in 1102 to steal those bodies. However obscure the saints, the remains were believed to be genuine, and their loss was bemoaned by the people of Braga. Thanks to the imaginations of generations of faithful devotees, thanks to the selfless dedication of Galmirez, who was willing to compromise his own conscience and indeed his own soul in the interests of his patron saint, all elements of the cult of James and of a promising pilgrimage industry were in place by the time Galmirez died. Now, I'm sorry, that's back. I now come to the image, as you'll see, of James in the book, Jacobus, that bears his name. Everything that had been written down, recorded, imagined, created, were gathered, reinforced, and buttressed in this book. The cathedral in Compostela possessed the first manuscript of it, if not by the time Galmirez died, certainly not long afterwards. They had it by 1173 when a copy was made by a monk from Ripoll named Arnaud. Where this book, the original one, was assembled and copied. It had 5 parts. How they were composed, how they were transcribed, how they were illustrated, how they were annotated, for many parts contain music, for there is music in them. These are questions that are hotly debated. They're fascinating questions that are still debated by scholars. As you will hear from the various experts who will be talking about the book, the French connections are paramount. Whether in France, whether it's French people who came to Spain, but the French connections are there. Now, none of the titles by which the book has been known declares any French connection. Jacobus is simply the name of James, and the Liber Sancti Jacobi is the book of St. James. The book is also called the Codex Calixtinus, and there you have Calixtus working away. This must be Calixtus II, the Pope who bestowed archiepiscopal status on Galmirez and Compostela. He appears in each of the book's 5 parts. Papal letters and bulls abound. One French scholar termed the Pope's initial letter in French fantaisiste. Now, if you look that word up, eccentric, odd, far-fetched, that is true of that letter and many other elements of this book. Now, this hardly, Codex Calixtinus does not bring France to mind, but those of you who know anything about Calixtus know that he was a son of Duke William of Burgundy, served as Archdeacon of Vienne in southeastern France before he was elected Pope by cardinals assembled at Cluny in Burgundy, again in France, in 1119 before he went to Rome. Any of you who are familiar with the book will know that the book has a colophon, or closing passage, that calls attention to Cluny. The scribe who had copied this book, generally they say, thank heavens this is finished and I can go and drink, but this is a longer colophon. The scribe says, glory to the scribe, equally to the reader, and then, flaunting the book's credentials, said, the Roman Church first attentively received this volume, which was written in many places in Rome, to be sure, but also on the shores of Jerusalem, in Gaul or France, in Italy, in Germany, in Frisia, and especially at Cluny. So the book is said to be an international project tied closely to Cluny. Now, this book is exceedingly curious. you could even say bizarre. Its narrative portions are disfigured by gross grammatical errors, infelicities that have been and can only be described as howlers. This striking feature of the book led the great English scholar Christopher Holer to conclude that the errors had been purposely introduced because he was a schoolmaster who wanted to create a book in which the students would have to take all the howlers out and thus learn good Latin. I love that idea. It is not one that great a following, but those who have other ideas have to prove why the howlers are there. And I haven't yet been, maybe somebody will have an idea here. It suggests that the book must have been treated more as an icon than as something that was actually read. If the clerks of Compostela actually read it and failed to laugh uproariously, their Latin was very limited and their gullibility immense. Let us now look at the contents. 5 parts. You might think that the first part would treat James's life, but there was very little to report. There was an uneasy fit between what the Bible said, etc. So this first part consists of liturgical offices, prayers, sermons, and chants to be used to celebrate James and his feast days. Holer commented, "There's nothing wrong with the music, but one gathers not much right. But you will have a chance to hear on November the 14th what you think of the music." Holer also pointed out all the errors. Like, it's St. James rather than St. Peter who's released from prison. Now, anybody who knows the Bible even minimally well might cough or laugh when he heard that. In any case. Now, the second part is dedicated to 22 of James's miracles. I think this is a very curious collection. Some of my colleagues think that it's not that curious, and they're very impressed. Now, I must admit, having worked with Saint-Denis, I am very partial to Saint-Denis' miracles, and my favorite one of all is Saint-Denis curing this poor boy who had been deaf from birth, and all of a sudden he could hear the bells of Saint-Denis tolling. But what's the real miracle is he could speak perfect French. Some of James's miracles seem to me what I can only describe as shaggy dog miracles. Now let me just, and there are others, well, you may hear others. Two of my favorites are prisoner miracles, because releasing prisoners was one of the all saints' chief occupations. Now, in one of them, there was a man chained on the bottom floor of a huge tower, and he prayed to St. James, and all of a sudden, St. James got him up to the top of the tower, and the guy jumped, and he landed unharmed. The next one, the prisoner was on the top floor. Maybe he was less athletic or something. And so he called on St. James, and St. James bent the tower down, and the guy just walked out free and was invisible to passers-by. I will leave it to others you can tell another miracle story, Allison. Now, this prepares the way, this collection of miracles, for the third part of Jacobus. And this is the greatest wonder of all, the translation of his remains, his apostolate in Spain, his execution, and then with the rudderless ship and the collapsing bridge and the bulls and the sundered dragon. That's part 3. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the fourth part, so let me just say that the fifth and final segment of the book is one about what you're going to hear a lot from Allison and in the next lectures. It is the famous and infinitely amusing and useful Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago, which is filled with stories and information both accurate and spurious. And you've already said Allison and a team of other scholars, including Paula Gerson, who's going to be speaking next week, are responsible for this magnificent critical edition, and a gazetteer, which appeared in the late 1990s. Now, I get to my favorite part of the book, the Historia Torpini. It's in one sense simply a continuation of the miracles recounted in the second and third parts. Here, the miraculous focuses on the person of the historical Charlemagne, the great European ruler, as you know, who was crowned first emperor of the West in Rome in 800. He himself would be canonized in 1165, at least in part because of all these legendary deeds that were recorded in Jacobus, and also another wonderful tale of how he had gone to Jerusalem and Constantinople and conquered everyone and brought back lots of relics. Now, this section of the book has come to be known as the Turpin, as you see, or call it the pseudo-Turpin to show that you know it's not real. Its title is derived from the name of the semi-fictional Archbishop of Reims, Tulpin. Here he appears as the author of this adventure-filled, mostly fictional account of Charlemagne's fight against the Muslims in Spain. Now, in a way it resembles the Song of Roland, on which it has, some scholars say it drew. It embroiders the tale of an actual expedition, not a very successful one, that Charlemagne took into Spain in 778. Now, everyone here, I'll wager, has heard of the Song of Roland. Probably lots of you have read it in school or college, and I'll bet very few of you have heard of and certainly read the Turpin. Now, this is very strange because it's the one of them's the mirror image of the other. The Roland survives, the Oxford Digby manuscript, and there are very few others. How many translations exist today? Hundreds. How many copies are in print? Millions. 3 pages of the Encyclopedia of Medieval France are dedicated to Roland, less than a page to pseudo-Turpin. And if you look under Turpin, you don't even have a reference back to pseudo. The renown and popularity of the Roland is, as I've said, the reverse mirror image of the Turpin. I don't know of any translations as yet into modern languages. In the Middle Ages, the Turpin was turned into French, many versions in French, Provençal, Catalan, Galician, Welsh, and Old Norse. The modern copies that exist today are just scholarly editions. How many surviving independent copies? Over 200. So everyone was reading it in the Middle Ages. Nobody's reading it now, but I hope that you will all go out and express your wish to read the Turpin. I will now tell you why you should. It is action, adventure-packed, cliffhanging episodes, comic, and sometimes uproariously funny incidents. I wrote on it once, and I called it a merry and gripping tale of strange times of yore. More candidly, Christopher Holer described it as unmitigated rubbish. Whatever one calls it, it is for sure a page-turner, sure to appeal to devotees of Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Narnia. It would make a great movie and a greater opera, although it would take Robert LePage would have to work hard to see it onto the stage. Now, St. James, entirely absent from the Song of Roland, plays a centrally important role in the Turpin. He is the initial protagonist in the story, since, you can see him at the top, at the beginning, he appears to Charlemagne in a dream to summon him to fight the Muslims in Spain. And he is as well, I don't know if this is a word, the antagonist, because at the end it's he who saves Charlemagne's soul from the demons who are gathered to cart it off to hell. James is central. Not as central as Turpin, but central nonetheless. Now, I'm going to begin by giving you just a flavor of the book at the beginning. It opens with the miraculous appearance of the glorious Apostle James. Now, Charlemagne is at home in Aachen. He has already conquered France, I'm quoting, France, England, Germany, Bavaria, Lorraine, Brittany, Lombardy, Burgundy, and all lands from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. If you think that includes Africa, you're in for, I think that can't do it. But he had wrested all these lands around the Mediterranean from the Saracens. He thought he deserved a rest. Time off from fighting. One night as he was sleeping, he saw a path a camino of stars leading from Phrygia through France and Aquitaine to Galicia, where the body of James lay somewhere buried. Charlemagne pondered. What could this mean? He spent an hour thinking hard. And then a great lord appeared to him and said, "What are you doing, dear son?" Charlemagne said, "Who are you?" "Lord," he said, "I am the Apostle James, beloved of Jesus Christ, son of Zebedee, brother of John the Evangelist, whom God chose to preach the word to all nations. But my body is in Spain, unknown and surrounded by Saracens. I am shocked that you, who have conquered so many lands, do not travel there to free me from the wretched heathens. After that, all people from one end of the world to the other will come in pilgrimage to seek pardon for their sins, and will then praise God until the end of time. So rise up and go as quickly as you can. I will help you, and I will see that God gives you heavenly glory and earthly renown." Now, Charlemagne must have been a little slow on the uptake because he had to repeat this 3 times before he got the message. But finally, Charlemagne took heed, assembled an army, and set forth. And you see him. He first came to Pamplona, which he besieged for 3 months without success. So he prayed to God and James, and in the twinkling of an eye, the walls of the city collapsed. The Saracens, who accepted baptism at the hand of Turpin, were left in peace. The others were massacred. Reports of what had happened had their effect. The Saracens fell in line, cast down their arms, wondering at the handsomeness, wealth, and strength of Charlemagne's soldiers. Charlemagne visited James' body, which he miraculously found, and thanked God. And then he returned home and tried to get some rest again. After progressing through all of Spain and destroying all the Saracens' idols, he could not rest because Agolant, the king of Africa, reconquered Spain and killed all the Christians. Well, this is how the story begins, and it continues in the very much the same vein. Campaign after campaign until Charlemagne is victorious and goes to Santiago, where he dedicates its church and bestows on it so many privileges. It is all Spain, and Galicia is subject to Santiago. The church is to be called apostolic because James was buried there. It's a wonderful passage brimming with privileges. But then, alas, he goes home, and there's Roncesvalles, and Roland dies. But your attention is diverted because Charlemagne goes marching through France, goes to Saint-Denis, and gives Saint-Denis less but similar privileges to those he had bestowed on Compostela. Then, either for the schoolboys or just to as a kind of tourist thing, Turpin describes the palace Charlemagne built at Aachen and its depiction of the 7 liberal arts. Then the miraculous portents that preceded Charlemagne's death, and then his salvation by James from all these demons who were gathered to take him off to hell. And finally, rather extraordinarily, Turpin tells about how he died and events in Spain that reveal James' power and authority. So ends the story, the marvelous tale that fascinated and intrigued generations of people who heard it. As I've said, it was repeatedly translated several times into French by noble families seeking to link themselves to Charlemagne. It was inserted into chronicles of the French kings, and I hope Allison's going to show you some of the manuscript. It inspired monuments, including a crusading window at Saint-Denis, which was probably installed by Abbot Odo of Deuil, who was a successor of Suger, sometime between 1151 and 1162. And this is a cheat, because what this is, the bottom 2 panels of this window, was taken in Glencairn, the museum there of the famous head of Pittsburgh stained glass, plate glass, who collected stained glass. The bottom panel shows crusaders who have been martyred and are then crowned from heaven. The second panel shows Charlemagne marching off to battle, and these are as they are mounted in the big house at Glencairn, when actually mounted at Saint-Denis, they were very different, but I don't have a reconstruction of that glass, so just take it from me. The window itself must have been as pretty as that one is. Now, this wonderful story may have led Louis VII to seek a Spanish bride after Eleanor of Aquitaine turned out to be a disaster. He married Constance of Castile, daughter of the crusading hero Alfonso VII of Castile. It doubtless influenced Louis and Constance to make a pilgrimage to Santiago in 1154. It may have had a part in motivating Henry II of England and Louis VII of France to plan a crusade against the Muslims in Spain in 1158. This crusade never came off. At some point in time, whether in the 12th century or much later is unclear, it resulted in the blatant forging of a privilege of Charlemagne for Saint-Denis, whose terms far exceeded anything that had been given in the Turpin. And it's been that privilege has been taken with so seriously that you will find it in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica. And if you look at what the source is, it's a book from Saint-Denis that dates to the 16th century, so don't be fooled by that. Obviously, the Turpin challenged the standing of Saint-Denis. Compostela profited far more handsomely from Charlemagne's largesse than did Saint-Denis. It was not by chance that in 1156, Odo of Deuil, the abbot, carried to Spain an arm of Eugenius, the alleged companion of Saint-Denis, an evangelist of Spain, and the first bishop of Toledo, to bestow it on the Church of Toledo, the bitter rival of Compostela for primacy in Spain. Now, in the long run, St. James and Santiago have clearly triumphed, not only over Toledo, but also over Saint-Denis and its suburb, Paris. Tourists visit Saint-Denis and Toledo, but not 200,000 pilgrims from all parts of the world. The physical miracles attributed to St. James the Greater may not be as extraordinary as those associated with Eugenius or Denis, or St. Louis, and the other saints associated with Saint-Denis. But the passionate devotion he inspires throughout the world is a tribute both to his own holiness and all Christ thought of him, but also to the dedicated work of those who, from Diego Galmirez to the Xunta of Galicia, have praised and promoted him and his see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for launching us on a journey from Jerusalem to Cluny to Saint-Denis and ultimately to Santiago, and with many illuminating insights. And now we'll all have to go out and find Turpin. Searching for Turpin is next, I think. Thank you.